Some principles of scientific communication would be clarity, having clearly written notes and orders, and also speaking clearly when you speak to patients, their family members, or other teammates. Another principle would be accuracy. So making sure that you have accurate data for when you would treat a patient or to conduct research. Another principle would be simplicity. So making sure that you have easily accessible reports and data, and also to make sure that the written data is easy to read. Another principle of scientific communication would be understandability. So with this principle, we want to make sure that everything is very easy to understand, and you are able to relay the information to someone else and they are able to understand it very clearly. Some ethical implications in human research. The first would be beneficence. So we want to make sure that we are doing good for our patients. Another would be non-maleficence. So we want to prevent harm at all costs. We also need to have trust when conducting research, especially human research. We need to be able to trust the provider as well as anyone else who may be caring for us. Another implication would be dignity. So being worthy, being dignified in being able to do research or conduct research. Another implication would be autonomy. So this is personal independence. This is everyone's free choice to do whatever they want with their body. And another implication would be privacy. So just making sure that we are keeping all information that we have personal and confidential, and keeping it secure to protect not only the facility that we work with, but also mainly to protect the patient. Some ethical issues surrounding communication, especially with human research. We want to be truthful and honest. We want to make sure that we are being honest with the participants of the study as well as those who are providing the study or conducting the study. Be sure that you're actively listening to both the patients and the person who's conducting the research, just so we know we're not missing anything. It's also important to be non-judgmental. We don't want to judge anyone for anything that they may have or have done, especially when it relates to research. It's always helpful to use personal experience, especially when you are conducting research in something that you are personally familiar with. It's also important to avoid a negative tone when you're speaking to someone. Just be very aware of how your voice sounds and how it may come across to someone else. It's important not to interrupt. Don't interrupt the patient, because that can make them feel that you don't care or that their time's not valuable. Always respect the patient's privacy. Do whatever we can to make sure that the patient feels that their privacy is not being given out, or that whatever happens during the study is going to stay within the study. And also accept responsibility. Things happen. So we want to make sure that if something is going on or something has happened, we want to be completely transparent with the patient and let them know. Some ways that we can communicate effectively with our patients. First of all, we want to make sure that we do an assessment of the patient to find out if there are any barriers for understanding what you may have to say. This could be medication that they're taking. It may make them drowsy. It may kind of make them feel a little off. Therefore, they will not retain the information that you give them. They could also not speak English. Many patients do speak another language. So therefore, they're not going to understand anything that we say, which could be a big barrier to retaining any information. Another way we can communicate effectively when we assess our patients to see if there are any altered mental status. Some patients have dementia or Alzheimer's, and therefore they're not going to really understand what you're saying, so they cannot retain it. In this case, you do want to make sure that you have family members present who do understand what you're saying so that they can effectively take care of the patient. In my practice, we use the teach back method with our patients. So we go through and show them or educate them on after visit instructions or procedures that they'll have to do once they get home, such as injections. Once we're finished showing them how to do it, we have the patient actually teach us in return what we just taught them. So therefore, we can make sure that they understand every step of the process. And it seems a little cliche with being the 21st century, but it's always important to write things down. A lot of information is always kind of given to patients at one time. So it's important to write things down so that we can make sure that the patients can go back to it later, and it can jog their memory. This can prevent the patients calling back into the office to ask the same questions over again. So just encouraging the patient to write things down so that they better understand what you're letting them know. Some ways that we can communicate effectively with patients' family members. It's very similar to how we would communicate effectively with the patients. It's kind of the same thing. We want to make sure that we familiarize the patient's family with everything that's going on and how to properly care for them, especially once they are discharged or when they leave the clinic. And just as we would write things down for patients, it's important to write things down for family members because they may be doing some things that the patient is not doing, especially if they are mostly being the caregivers for the patient. We want to make sure that they write down everything, again, to eliminate calls in the office and just so the patient feels comfortable when they leave the office with their family members. Some ways to communicate effectively with other healthcare members. First of all, we want to identify their job title. We want to make sure that we familiarize ourselves with their scope of practice. This way, we're not asking them to do anything that is outside of their scope of practice or anything that they are not comfortable with. We also want to make sure, especially when working on any kind of team, but especially a healthcare team, that we have very clear and honest communication. We want to make sure that we communicate effectively with each other and eliminate confrontation. Some ways to effectively communicate using formal correspondence. So when you are sending letters to either patients or other providers, you want to make sure that you identify clearly, state your goal. So whatever you are trying to do with the message or the letter, you want to make sure that you clearly state that in the body of the letter. You also want to keep it simple. So especially if this is to a provider or even a patient, you don't want to put too much information in there just to confuse, to cut down on the confusion. It's also important to be professional. So also make sure that your spelling is correct and that you're using the proper title when addressing the person that you are going to be sending the communication to.